On May 1st, 1960, deep within the hostile airspace of the Soviet Union, the unthinkable happened. And this is where the nightmare begins. An American U-2 spy plane, flying at an unreachable altitude, vanished from radar screens. But here's the kicker. A Soviet surface-to-air missile successfully locked onto the aircraft, sending it spiraling down to Earth. The pilot survived and Washington was caught in a massive lie. And it gets even crazier. The balance of global power shifted in a single afternoon. The skies over Moscow were no longer safe. But here is where American defiance completely changes the game. The United States military did not back down. Instead, the Pentagon decided to completely rewrite the laws of physics. And that's exactly where things get interesting. They realized they didn't just need a better plane, they needed a ghost. Listen closely to this. They needed an aircraft so radically advanced, so blindingly fast, and so high-flying that no radar could accurately track it, and absolutely no missile on Earth could ever hope to catch it. To pull off this impossible miracle, President Eisenhower turned to a top-secret division at Lockheed Martin called the Skunk Works. Pay close attention to this group. This was a gathering of America's most brilliant rogue engineers, led by Kelly Johnson. And this is where the magic happens. They designed the entire aircraft using nothing but slide rules, pencils, and pure American intuition. But they immediately hit a brick wall that nearly killed the entire project. Kelly Johnson's design required the aircraft to fly at speeds exceeding Mach 3, more than 3 times the speed of sound. Think about that for a second. At that extreme velocity, atmospheric friction would generate a catastrophic amount of heat. The outer skin of the aircraft would instantly reach temperatures above 900 degrees Fahrenheit. But notice the flaw here. Standard aviation aluminum, used for every fighter jet at the time, loses its structural strength and melts like butter. The project was dead in the water, or so the enemy thought. American engineers refused to give up, and they found the only solution left on Earth. They had to build the entire aircraft out of a space-age miracle metal, titanium. But here is the real crisis. The United States simply did not have enough raw reserves to build a fleet. And that brings us to the most shocking twist in history. Do you want to guess who owned the largest supply of high-grade titanium on the planet? It was the Soviet Union itself. Listen closely to this massive irony. The very enemy that America desperately needed to spy on held the absolute keys to the only material that could make the plane fly. It was a geopolitical checkmate, but they missed one crucial detail: American audacity. The CIA immediately stepped into the shadow game. And it gets even better. They knew that if the Soviet government found out the US military needed titanium, Moscow would lock down their exports instantly. So the masterminds in Washington designed a covert operation. Look at the sheer scale of this deception. The CIA secretly established a massive network of fake shell companies all over the globe. These fake front companies started approaching Soviet suppliers. Pay close attention to how they played the enemy. They claimed they needed massive amounts of titanium for completely civilian manufacturing, like building commercial refrigerators and cargo ships. The Kremlin, blinded by greed, swallowed the bait hook, line, and sinker. And here is the ultimate twist. The Soviet Union willingly packed up their most precious military titanium and shipped it directly across the ocean. But they had absolutely no idea where it was going. They thought they were selling scrap metal for kitchen appliances. In reality, they were shipping the raw, indestructible muscle of the SR-71 Blackbird straight into the secret hangars of California. The Soviets were literally funding and building the very machine engineered to expose their deepest secrets. And that's exactly when Detroit and American ingenuity turned Soviet raw materials into an untouchable American legend. Once the stolen Soviet titanium arrived in California, American engineers realized they had a brand new problem. And this is where the madness truly begins. Titanium is so incredibly tough that standard factory drills shattered into pieces when trying to shape it. But here's the kicker. The team at Skunk Works had to invent completely new manufacturing tools, specialized drills, and unique welding techniques from scratch. Mark this down. They were literally creating a new industrial era on the fly. When the aircraft finally rolled out of the secret hangar, it looked like a spaceship. And it gets even crazier. The SR-71 Blackbird was built with a feature that defied all conventional aviation logic. When it sat on the tarmac before takeoff, it literally leaked highly specialized fuel all over the ground. Think about how insane that sounds. The fuel tanks didn't have rubber seals because no rubber could survive the extreme 900-degree heat of supersonic flight. But notice the genius of American engineering here. Kelly Johnson designed the metal panels of the aircraft to fit loosely on purpose while on the ground. Pay close attention to this. Once the Blackbird blasted into the sky and hit Mach 3, the intense atmospheric friction caused the titanium skin to expand by several inches. And that's exactly where the magic happens. The heat itself sealed the fuel tanks perfectly midair. But the fuel itself was another American masterpiece. Listen closely to this. The aircraft used a custom fuel called JP7, which was so stable and chemically advanced that you could literally drop a lit match into a bucket of it, and the match would just go out. It required a special chemical starter just to ignite the massive Pratt & Whitney engines. Now, while the engineering was mind-blowing, the true spirit of the Blackbird lived inside the cockpit. And this is where the story gets legendary. The pilots didn't wear normal flight gear. They wore full pressurized astronaut spacesuits. They were flying so high, at 85,000 feet, that they could clearly see the curvature of the Earth and the pitch-black darkness of space above them. They were completely untouchable, and they knew it. And that brings us to the most famous radio transmission in military history. Major Brian Schul, a legendary Blackbird pilot, loved to tell the story of a beautiful day over Southern California. Listen to how they played the arrogance of other pilots. Schul and his navigator were cruising through the sky when they overheard the local air traffic control frequency. A civilian Cessna pilot keyed his mic and asked the tower for a readout of his ground speed. The tower responded, 90 knots. A few moments later, a cocky Twin Beach pilot, wanting to show off, asked for his speed. The tower replied, 120 knots. But here is where things get really interesting. A Navy F-18 Hornet pilot entered the frequency. He wanted to shut everyone down and prove who owned the sky. In a smug professional voice, the fighter pilot asked for his speed check. The controller responded, 520 knots. The Navy pilot felt victorious. He was the fastest man in the valley, or so he thought. Look at the ultimate American twist. Brian Schul looked at his navigator. They decided it was time to show them what real American muscle sounded like. Schul keyed his mic, completely calm, and asked the tower for a speed check of their own aircraft. Pay close attention to the controller's voice. The tower controller, completely stunned by his radar screen, hesitated for a second, cleared his throat, and transmitted, I show you at 1,842 knots. Think about that contrast. The frequency went completely dead. The arrogant fighter pilot never said another word. And that is the exact moment everyone in the sky realized that the United States military wasn't just flying a plane, they were operating a machine that belonged to a completely different civilization. As the Cold War escalated into the late 1960s and 1970s, the Soviet Union grew absolutely desperate to destroy this American ghost. And this is where the real battlefield drama peaks. The Soviet military deployed their top air defense systems, including the ultra-fast MiG-25 interceptors and thousands of surface-to-air missiles. They knew the Blackbird was actively capturing their most classified nuclear secrets. But here's the kicker. The Americans didn't even bother to hide. They would fly right through the most heavily defended airspace on the planet, knowing the enemy was completely powerless to stop them. Now look at the tactical reality of how the Blackbird defended itself. Listen closely to this. The SR-71 carried absolutely zero weapons. No missiles, no guns, no bombs. It didn't need them. Pay close attention to its standard operating procedure. Whenever a Soviet radar locked onto the aircraft and a multi-million-dollar surface-to-air missile was launched, the pilot didn't deploy flares or engage in a dogfight. And that's exactly where the magic happens. The manual instructions for the pilot were beautifully simple. Just push the throttles forward and accelerate. Think about the sheer humiliation for the Soviet missile crews. They would watch their radar screens as the missile raced upward at terrifying speeds. But then, the Blackbird would simply unleash its massive ramjet engines, outrunning the missile entirely. Mark this down. Over the course of its legendary career, enemy forces fired more than 4,000 missiles at the SR-71 Blackbird. And here is the ultimate statistic. Not a single one ever touched it, not even a scratch. The aircraft retired with a perfect, undefeated survival record. But it gets even better when you realize the psychological impact this had on the Kremlin. Soviet engineers spent decades trying to reverse engineer their own version of the Blackbird. But notice the flaw here. They couldn't replicate the advanced metallurgy, the fuel efficiency, or the technology that the United States had mastered using slide rules and pencils. Mark this down. Every single time a Blackbird roared over their heads, it was a brutal reminder that American technology was decades ahead of anything they could ever produce. When the SR-71 completed its final military mission, it broke one last record just to remind the world who owned the skies. Look at this final display of power. On its retirement flight from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C., the Blackbird crossed the entire United States continent in just 64 minutes. Think about that speed. It was traveling faster than a bullet fired from a rifle, moving across the nation it spent decades protecting. The true legacy of the Blackbird isn't just that it was the fastest aircraft in history, and that is the ultimate twist. It stands as a monument to what happens when American audacity and free enterprise combine to achieve the impossible. The Soviet Union tried to lock down the world behind an iron curtain, but they missed the ultimate irony. They willingly sold the very metal that tore that curtain wide open. And that is exactly how America turned Soviet titanium into the greatest, most untouchable legend the skies have ever seen.